No, it's
All right.
here. Let's get it.
Marcus, thank you for bringing us together, man. This is exciting.
Yeah,
No,
all
thanks to y'all. All thanks to y'all. The only thing I did, they asked me, oh, who's like your wish list, your fan list, and I was like, oh, I scribbled that right away. So everybody on this call, it's like I'm huge fans of y'all. Not to make it, not to fan out too much, but yeah, man. So thank you for taking the time. Yeah, we could start with the introductions. I'll go. I won't make it too long. My name is Marcus J. Moore. I am a Brooklyn-based and Nairobi, Kenya-based music journalist and author with a book that just came out yesterday, The Butterfly Effect, How Kendrick Lamar Ignited the Soul of Black America. Other than that, I cover jazz, more so like spiritual jazz and all kinds of crazy stuff for the New York Times and Bandcamp and NPR and so forth. So if we could just go from there, Nate, if you can kick it off,
Thank you, Marcus, and congratulations again on the book. It's very exciting. My name is Nate Chinen. I am the author of Playing Changes, Jazz for the New Century. I am ex-New York Times, ex-Jazz Times. I'm now the director of editorial content at WBGO and a contributor to NPR Music. And yeah, I'm also a part of the extended Newport Jazz Festival family, as someone who used to work with George Wein and co-authored his book. This is my Newport Jazz streaming shirt from this summer. It's all in the family. I'm happy to be here.
Right on. Nubya, tell us what you got going.
Oh yeah, my name is Nubya Garcia and I'm a musician. My main instrument is tenor saxophone. I'm a band leader, composer, performer, and huge music enthusiast, obviously. But I think it's always important to say how much I love what I do. And I just put an album out like a month and a half ago, my first debut solo thing. So still like riding high from that, even though I can't really play it at the moment. But yeah, I'm just feeling very thankful to have that opportunity to put out part one of my story, I guess. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Right on. Chief, I see you over there with all the drums. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
All right. Well, I'm Christian Scott aTunde Adjuah. I'm a trumpeter, composer. I produce music as well. I own and operate an app company and a record label called Stretch Music. And I'm a band leader as well. For people that know me more intimately, I'm also a chieftain in the Black tribes of New Orleans. And I am currently in Los Angeles.
Right on. My man Gio, what's going on?
Hey, I'm Giovanni Russonello. I cover jazz, stretch music, experimental music, all related things musically and music adjacent for the New York Times. And I also write about politics. I'm very much digging your hoodie, Marcus. I'm a fellow DMV native and I run a small organization there called Capital Bop, which advocates for the music and tries to keep it thriving in DC.
Hey man, thank you, man. And of course, PG all day, PG Maryland all day. So you know what it is. Now I wanted to start, like I was saying, obviously the year 2020, I feel like it's felt like 5 years rolled into one. So music aside, writing aside, I just want to get into a conversation about how we're navigating it. How is everybody, I know it's a broad question, how is everybody feeling at the moment? Because obviously we're still taking in all the stimuli. We still have to, look at the news and deal with politics and things like that. So just on the human level, how's everybody holding up? And whoever can jump in.
Is it too early for a drink?
It's 5 o'clock somewhere.
No,
it's always 5 o'clock somewhere.
Yeah.
No, all right. It's just about 4 there. Yeah.
I need to be on London time right now. I mean, I guess I'll start. This has been a year of it hasn't all been bad. You know, it's been highs and lows for me. The lows have been very, very low, and there've been a lot of them. But you know, it's also been a time of like, you know, like for those of us with families at home, you know, it's a very sweet time with my two kids. And you know, I was just telling someone this. It's been kind of an amazing year for improvised music. So much good stuff has come out, you know, including by Nubya and by Christian. I mean, I feel very inspired by what's happening right now. And so it's this constant mixed feeling, you know, just I feel like I'm always trying to process the news and maintain sanity and you know, everything else. But at the same time, the music is sustaining, you know. Maybe a little later we can talk about a story I have from April that involves me and Gio. But I don't have to go there right now. That's on the darker side. I just wanted to say, like, yes, it's been ups and downs.
Yeah. So, Nubya, how about you? How's everything going?
Same, really. Like extreme highs, lots of lows. I feel this has been a huge time of reflection for me. This whole year, actually, even before lockdown kind of began, and we entered that kind of stage of things. I think I've been on the road for 2 years prior to the beginning of this year. So I came home and felt like a huge, like, wow, I'm finally home. And then that turned into like, I'm always home because, you know, nothing's really going on outside. So in that, there was a lot of time for reflection and thought on, you know, what do I value basically, and what do I represent, and what am I trying to say in the actions that I do, the music that I make, the people that I surround myself with, what can I give to my community other than music. Like, so that's been a lot, but also like really encouraging to know that I do have a community of wondrous souls around me, musical and otherwise, and all around the world. So yeah, I think it's just been a lot. 2020 has been a lot. It's been like pow, pow, pow all the time. And I'm just taking each day as it comes, trying not to overwhelm myself with everything that's on the internet, and learning a new kindness to myself.
Yeah. Now, if Gio, I saw you shaking your head, and the thing that I've always appreciated about your writing, and you too, Nate, where even though, you know, just by definition, we're, you know, journalists, right? And we're not supposed to, by historical definitions, we're not supposed to really feel, we're supposed to just kind of talk about what's going on, and that's that. Maybe that's an archaic model, but that's kind of newsrooms I came up in. But Gio, if you could talk a little bit about like, how do you bring in all of what's happening in the world and spin it into what you're writing? Because what I was trying to say is, I feel like your writing is very emotive, you know, and you can definitely feel the spirit in whoever you're covering in your writing. So how do you bring all of that in and still remain sane enough to write on deadline?
First of all, thank you. And the compliment is repaid in double your way, I would say, for sure. And I think you're right that we both probably have looked at history in terms of music writing and seen a lot of traps that we could fall into, and maybe think about new ways to do it and new ways to try at least to imagine our way into what we're covering and listen our way into what we're covering, as opposed to judging or categorizing or things like that, which is always a challenge. And I find myself falling down in that challenge all the time. Simply, you know, the power of history and the weakness of one person or whatever. But I do think that, yeah, you're right. That's a goal. And I think in some ways covering politics alongside music, politics with a capital P, you know, kind of within the terror dome of what we consider American politics these days, has helped and hurt at the same time for me, because it does foreshorten your imagination in a lot of ways, to be writing about the same cast of kind of prefabricated characters that waltz down the hallways in Washington, D.C. every day. So, because I don't know, I'm sure most people watching this are not totally familiar with what I cover, but literally, I mean, I cover day-to-day politics, like the Washington grind, you know? And then I also am writing about some of the most mind-expanding and like really future-opening music that I think we have. It really does come down to like trying to listen as opposed to see, for me. And seeing, I think of as a kind of categorizing, a kind of gaze. Listening, I think of as a much deeper interaction, and one of receptivity, and one of kind of giving yourself over. And I think if you can really like bring yourself fully to the task of just being open and trying to learn from the material, then you can get a lot further than if you try to bring in, if you think of yourself as a quote unquote expert who brings in a set of assumptions. You know, knowledge becomes assumptions really quickly in that way. So anyway, I guess to be brief about it, I would just say this has been an amazing year to do a lot of listening. This has been a really incredible time to try to humble myself as much as possible, because in that process, I've been able to go back through history. I think because the news cycle has kind of churned down to a standstill in a lot of ways, although Nate rightly makes the point that these musicians that we have out here are doing incredible work under these circumstances, putting out amazing records, finding ways to do their thing online, do it distanced, make Brooklyn, where I live, into an amazing habitat of spontaneous musical creativity, like walking down the street. So this has been an amazing time, but I think being able to do some historical research into the role of protest, for instance, in music, in this music specifically, has really just been a time to redouble my efforts to sort of, you know, learn. And as Nubya was articulating, I think that it often can make you think in extra musical or paramusical ways about what your contribution might be. And I've found myself questioning my role as a writer much more. That's another conversation. And just thinking about how to throw in your kind of your weight into struggle a little more directly. But maybe we'll get to that later.
Yeah, and while you were talking, it reminded me, Chief, like when I listen to your music, man, and I don't spit hyperbole at all. Like I've never heard anybody play horn the way that you play it, you know. And I'm curious, you know, he was talking about mind expanding music and expansive music, and obviously you have a brand of music called stretch music. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, and has your brand of music, experimental music, shifted at all in the current landscape?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the main way that it's shifted is that we are starting to focus more on reevaluation, right? And being really clear about, you know, and intentional about how we move forward in this moment, you know. Obviously the music that we've been creating for years has really been kind of tethered to sort of we're attempting to decolonialize this space, right? And so a big part of that, you know, requires that we actually have an accurate appraisal of what has actually happened before, right? And that, you know, those aren't just musical things. I mean, it also relates to what Gio was talking about as well, all of these relationships. And so with stretch music specifically, you know, we understood the utility of creating a sound that was essentially genre blind in its acculturation of other vernacular musically, in a generation when you have so much cross-pollination music, right? So it's going to be difficult to communicate clearly to someone that's been listening to 20 different cultures of music via one language in an era where people are also inundated with the phone. So we needed to find a way to try and communicate and unify people under one understanding when we're communicating musically. And so I think in this time period specifically, you know, for me, I think more of the work has really been about just sharpening what it is that we're doing so that we effectively communicate, right? And so when I speak about that reevaluation, part of what I mean is, like, obviously I'm in a room here that has Awe drums, Akan drums, you know, you have the Numba drums and all of these, you know, and so we made this record, Ancestral Recall, and when we made the record, you know, some people obviously really loved it, but other people were confused as to why we were adding elements of African drums into creative improvised music. Like these were conversations and arguments that I would have to have. And obviously everyone on this panel understands the utility of these drums in this context, because this is actually the core space where this music actually comes from. It's the root of the tree, right? And so during this period, you know, you're having these conversations all the time, and what you're realizing is, what we're realizing is that the narratives that have been projected about this music are actually false. A lot of them are false, right? And obviously, you know, we speak about this reevaluation in broad and blanket terms, but I think a big component of that also has to do with, you know, for lack of a better way of putting it, sometimes we end up in spaces where we project people as being pundits or being knowledgeable about cultures that actually don't have that information and are not really initiated. And they end up projecting these narratives that are not really clear to the listener. And then they conclude based on those narratives that are projected, right? So just as an example, I know I'm running on a little bit here, but I think this is really important distinction and point. So when we're creating what it is that we're creating, there's obviously intentions in that, there's obviously a canon to that, there's obviously a methodology that leads into those things. And when folks that don't come from the sort of linearly come from that cultural space are speaking and opining and projecting people as being like the anointed ones or the kings or queens of this music without actually having or being rooted or grounded in that knowledge and that information, it's also really dangerous, right? So sort of to what Gio is saying, and also what Nate is intimating in his writing in certain spaces, part of what also needs to be reevaluated is who is speaking and why, right? And it's the same thing musically. And that's not to say that people do not have the right to opine and to conjecture about what it is that they're hearing from, you know, that's not what I mean, but really more of what I'm speaking to is that if you are going to actually, you know, be a gatekeeper in a certain sense, if you're going to be in that position, then to make sure that you have as much information as possible and that you go to the actual master level people in that industry or in that culture before you're actually saying some of the things that you're actually saying. And so that's also part of what we're protesting. That's also a component to decolonializing this music as well. And I know that that answer is very wide, but I think it's important to also be really clear and give comprehensive answers about what we know or the impediments to moving forward. And so that's a huge part of the reevaluation that we're doing in this moment as well.
Just a quick aside, then I'm gonna get out the way and ask the question. I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because the book that I came out with yesterday, the subtitle is How Kendrick Lamar Ignited the Soul of Black America, right? So what I'm noticing so far is that the reviews are totally split along racial lines, right? It's Black people who are like, oh, I get it. You're talking about jazz, you're talking about Black Lives Matter, you're talking about all this stuff. White critics aren't really diving into that. They were more so looking for the standard celebrity bio. You know, for page 1, Kendrick Lamar was born in this hospital. Page 250, here he is now with the Pulitzer, and it wasn't that. So you saying that now is totally singing my song, man, because I've been noticing that right away. So
yeah, that was like, sorry.
Yeah.
No, that was like the initial reaction to ancestral recall. It's like, in a nutshell, it was split, you know? And I think it, you know, to be clear and to be fair, I think a lot of that is also, like I said, is based in people's perceptions that are not usually being built by the practitioners, right? So that's a big component to this as well, is that when we project a narrative that tries to define jazz as being, and this is what I learned in New Orleans as a younger person in school, but not in the spaces where you actually learn the music, but the projection of the music is that it is West African harmony, right? And West African rhythm, excuse me, and European harmony. Traditionally, if you go into a classroom in the jazz studies space, that's what they're going to say. Jazz is a fusion of African harmony and African rhythm, excuse me, and European harmony. And part of the problem with these sort of ideas is that it creates this really weird chasm and this energy that says, well, there's no harmony in West Africa, right? Or that those people that came here did not have those types of traditions. Now, you and I both know that if we go and we walk around in Bamako, you'll hear somebody playing Ngoni, and what you'll hear them playing sounds frighteningly similar to Robert Johnson and Muddy Waters. So we know that those harmonic traditions actually existed in those spaces, but for the purposes of codifying this music as a classical form, there was a utility in framing it in the way that it's been framed. So when we made this record, in a sense, to try and create a document to decolonialize sound through rhythm and to show the harmonic tendencies that exist in rhythm and why that music is as nuanced and as sophisticated as other forms, then there was a bit of a fight back because there's this cognitive dissonance with that narrative that's been projected and projected and projected that says that jazz is essentially also a byproduct of a well-tempered system. There's a piano behind me here, right? So well-tempered, obviously this is the Western European sort of how these instruments actually ring and vibrate harmonically is a very specific thing. Whereas if I'm playing an Ngoni or I'm playing a kora or I'm playing a sitar, these instruments obviously are wavering in a completely different way. And so it doesn't make any room for that. So we thought it was necessary to try and create a space musically that also illuminated the actual core cultural space of this music in a way where you could hear it in the modern context. So yeah, I understand that you go through that, and that's something I think Nubya can probably say she's probably experienced to a certain degree as well.
Yeah, and that's why I was going to go there, Nubya. If you could talk about that, then Nate, I have a question for you. But obviously, you know, Nubya, if you have a response to that, and then also I wanted to give you a space to, you know, sort of tell us about what your music and what your album conveys.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what you're both saying, and definitely Christian. I think from my experience with dealing with, you know, since the album has come out, people talking about it, people writing about it, it's, and even the questions, actually, the questions that have been asked, they're obviously very similar, etc., but they kind of already, it feels like they already have a story that they have written or what they have deduced from the music and the way that I play. Mm-hmm. And even the instrument that I play, like, I find it quite, yeah, perplexing that when I arrive to the conversation and the interview, that it's usually, you know, oh, well, this is the saxophone's role in jazz, and your album is a jazz album, and this means this to me. And I think it's been a really interesting and difficult at times to navigate, actually. I'm not trying to run away from the jazz idiom. You know, I'm honored to be involved and thought worthy of the genre. Like, that's not the issue. The issue is that there's so much else in my album. There's so many other influences. There's so much, there's a different culture that people just aren't really recognizing within, you know, the Caribbean. I'm from the Caribbean, and this whole album is me essentially navigating that, trying to get back to the beginning as such, in terms of my family's history, the music that my parents grew up on, the stories that my grandparents and my parents have told me about music and about life there. I didn't grow up there. I've been to Trinidad a lot. But yeah, anyway, I'm getting off topic, but I think I've just noticed that people have an idea of what they think my music is, and that idea is about 20% of it, or just a portion of it. And like you said, Christian, the narrative is so boxed. It's like, this is what this is. And I'm like, okay, but what about all these other stuff? I did a track in Colombia, you know, I did a cumbia track with a band from there. Like, I mean, it's just, it's quite interesting what's ignored and what isn't, what is chosen to talk about. And yeah, I found it quite hard to navigate in a way that doesn't like offend. I find like when I kind of come against those questions, I'm like, oh no, actually, you know, this was this, and this is where this influence has come from, and you know, we have a Nyabingi track and XYZ, this is what this means to me, and sound system culture in London and the Caribbean is also completely throughout the whole fabric of the album. That's like in my soul, you know. I'm a child of Carnival, and that, yeah, it's just, I feel like a lot of people don't know how to talk about that. People, I'm not just, this isn't just about journalists, but I feel like people that are listening to the album as well are also like, oh no, but she plays jazz, and this is what jazz is. So yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting process, and I'm learning a lot of how to converse about something, to educate without being, what's the word, like aggressive in the way that I try and explain something that's very close to my heart but someone else doesn't understand at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I hop in, Marcus?
Yeah, sir.
I don't want to cut off Nate. I know you had a question for Nate, but there's just so much that I'm thinking about here and that resonates. And you know, it's definitely been a time to like reappraise one's relationship to the tradition that one's within, like this year, but also hopefully always, you know, is a good moment for that. And I think for me, like all these things you're describing, Nubya and Christian, like all these things that you're describing feel related to that dichotomy that I've been trying to use that I mentioned before in terms of looking and gazing versus listening and hearing. And I think that the taxonomizing, the labeling, and the separating, and the sort of boxing it's frankly a history of it's a Western history, and it's a history of claiming and conquering and labeling, and it's a history wherein turning something into a kind of commodity or a kind of property or a kind of thing that can be managed is the power. And the actual creation of the thing gets demoted, right? So if the creators are empowered, there's a lot less that matters about how you taxonomize it or how you label it or how you even understand it, you know, from a mental standpoint, from a labeling standpoint. And I think that like this moment, I mean, it's sort of like you can read a historian on the Great Migration, for instance, but like if you read Beloved, you understand something so much richer because it's actually written from within an experience that's like way beyond the labels. I mean, it just breaks out of any kind of labeling, right? And it's like if we can actually use words about this music with the same level of richness, and that's something that honestly somebody in my position maybe never will be able to do. But maybe there's a way to like write into the experience of listening from my perspective that's as appreciative and as open and as learning oriented as one might hope, you know, as opposed to coming in and thinking that because I'm writing about this music, my role is to be an expert. I think there's a difference between being learned or being passionately engaged and being somebody who's posing as an expert and therefore is there to separate, taxonomize, and assert. You know, I
have a point there, Marcus. Yeah. I don't know if I'm like
no, go in, bro.
Jumping on your question, but you know, so I guess I'm the old guy here today, right? I am approaching my mid-40s, so that makes me the old man in this scenario, which is fine. I'll take it. But you know, the point I want to make is that some of what we're talking about are these, you know, Gio, you mentioned taxonomies. We're talking about sort of structures that are set up for the purpose of sorting and kind of making sense of things. And that work is done by critics, it's done by historians, and then it's also done intentionally or unintentionally by the industry and this sort of the whole apparatus of commerce and everything, right? But I want to talk about criticism specifically for a moment because I came up at a time when, you know, okay, here are the critical narratives and here are the models that we have. This is what jazz criticism is, right? And I remember saying like, okay, Martin Williams, okay, it's time to really go deep on Martin Williams and figure this out, you know, and it happened at the same time that I was learning about the new criticism in literature and, you know, sort of, it's all about the text. It's the, you know, intention doesn't matter, it's the text. And so there's this famous moment in sort of jazz criticism where Martin Williams decides that Sonny Rollins is just the paragon of thematic improvisation. And he says like this, this is what it is, right? And he takes a track from Saxophone Colossus that I'm sure you both know, I'm sure everyone knows, Blue 7, right? Mm. And he talks about the way that Sonny Rollins develops this narrative and this structure in the solo. And he talks about it in, very formal terms. And then he basically says, Blue 7 is a masterpiece. I mean, that's literally, he says, Blue 7 is a masterpiece, right? Now, you would imagine that that's a really cool thing to hear if you're Sonny Rollins. Mm-hmm. But if you ever talk to Sonny about this moment, you realize just how destabilizing and alien that idea is to him as a practitioner, as an artist, And that was a really big lesson for me when I had a chance to sit down with Sonny and talk about, how he sees this whole thing, he didn't reject Martin Williams's perspective, or his authority as a listener, he appreciated that, but it's just a completely alien way of thinking about the creation of the music. And I think that was very instructive for me. And, going back to Gio's sort of binary between seeing and hearing, I think you used the word humbled. Humility is a big part of this equation. There is no way to really deeply be listening without engaging in some humility. No matter how much of an expert you are, if you're listening, you are being humble in some way. I guess there are critics you could point to and as exceptions to that rule, so I think that it has been really heartening to see, because I do think some of this is generational. It's been great to see a new model or a different model emerge that is much more attuned to cultural context, that is much more attuned to human experience. And looks not only at the artist's intention, but also the whole web of relationships that this music operates within. How the audience receives and responds. All of this. It's an ecology ultimately, mm-hmm. And everyone has a part to play in that, and no one can fully understand it or predict it, you're just a part of it. And so that's been a really useful framework for me. It certainly informed my book, and it's been a kind of a revelation for me, let's say within the last decade or so. And it's made me very happy to see, Gio, to see the work you're doing, and Marcus to see the work you're doing, and others who are just now coming up, and look and say, okay, well, these are folks who are attuned to the historical narratives, like they understand where we're coming from, but their perspective is organically aligned with the stuff that I'm describing. Whereas I feel like it wasn't always that way with the critics and journalists, of a previous generation.
And I think, with what Gio intimated earlier too, I think he actually put it perfectly, because, that's also the process for the musicians, right? Is to, when you speak about the differences between, how we perceive things and listening. And, to me, listening carries with it, this energy of trying to actually understand, right? And an openness that doesn't really exist when we're looking at things. Sometimes when I'm dealing with children, I grew up in, in an environment where my grandmother and mother owned nurseries. And, we would always tell the kids when they were interacting with each other, not to think with their eyes, right? And so when you speak about the utility in listening, I think that's really all of the things that we're talking about, whether or not we're talking about what's going on in terms of the larger culture, in terms of what's happening politically in this country, what's happening socially, or if we're talking interculturally, most of the issues and impediments that we have are usually a byproduct of us not listening to each other, right? Mm-hmm. And so, when you said earlier, you don't know that you'll ever be able to get to that space, to me as a musician and a practitioner, if I'm working with a student or working with someone that's coming up, if they intimate what you just intimated, you know, and also Nate, when you speak about Sonny Rollins being in a space where he can't even accept that fully because he knows he has work to do. That idea of listening and evaluating and processing all of those things is exactly what is required to actually get to the next level. And ultimately, like, we all are in a process of growing, you know, like we all have relationships. Gio, you and I have known each other for quite a while, and our relationship has grown a lot, you know? Yeah. And so the point is that doesn't happen if we don't take the moment and time to actually process where each of us is in that moment, you know? Yeah. And so, you know, I just want to make sure that, you know, I'm saying that too, because I know a lot of times it feels like the musicians are kind of like beating up on the writers, you know, about, you know, well, but what about this? And you only talked about that. And I'm not doing all of these things. But, you know, at the end of the day, everyone is in a process of growing. Even the 94-year-old person that's maybe writing an expose for Downbeat magazine, you know, that wrote about Louis Armstrong at one point, that person is also still in a space of growing. And I think if we relate to each other in those terms and in those ways, then this is the thing that helps us move forward and to heal in a moment that is so taxing and so difficult, is tapping into that energy. So, you know, I applaud you guys for what you're intimating, because that's beautiful.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, Jill, you want to jump in? Or
no, I mean, Christian's absolutely right that through even just our interactions throughout the years, which have, you know, been they've just been a space of learning for me, and I think that I've been grateful for that. And he's been able to share things that have really helped me sort of self-evaluate in a lot of ways as a writer. And you know, there's sometimes even collateral damage, and that's why I think you guys do beat up on us writers, because you realize that the words have power, you know, and that's why, you know, as a writer, I'm sure Nate and Marcus, you guys relate to this. You beat yourself up over words that come out because you stare them in the face and you're like, oh God, really?
Oh man.
Let that one just like hang out there, you know? And now it's not coming back. Like I let it out and there it is. But I appreciate that, because, you know, it's a process of that wouldn't happen without the generosity, honestly, of these artists like yourselves, who are actually willing to put yourselves in that vulnerable position of having words thrown at and onto the stuff that you're creating, you know? So.
Yeah, and just to switch gears a little bit, obviously we're talking about, you know, protest music and conveying peace and all of this stuff in the music. I guess my next question is more of a broad one, but I think it has, you know, several parts to it. I've been wrestling with this idea of spiritual jazz, right? Where, you know, when you hear certain music, at least for me as a writer, if I hear like an Alice Coltrane or somebody like that, I'm trained to think, maybe through old criticism, that, oh, this is a spiritual jazz record. But then now I'm thinking, I'm like, well, isn't jazz in and of itself a spiritual art form? You know what I mean? So it's like, what is the difference? So I guess, you know, I say all that to say, can spiritual jazz be protest music as well? If we can riff on that for a little bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think all of the music is, you know, energetically sort of tethered to that idea, right? Because the cultural spaces that the music comes from are spaces where there are, you know, the history has been the history. So I don't think for me, I don't like to separate and make those types of distinctions when I'm speaking and dealing with music. And I know, like, one of the things that Nubya intimated, you spoke about like your history in the Caribbean, right? And obviously, like, for me as a New Orleanian person, we have a Caribbean history as well, but also the root of the music starts in that environment. And part of what you learn as you're learning and you know, you're younger and you're developing, you're auditing these spaces. But one of the things that you're learning on your process during the process of becoming initiated in this music is that it is all tethered and rooted in your spirituality, right? So those aren't things that maybe make it to like Cleveland, Ohio, or different spaces in terms of like what's being taught in jazz education, right? In universities and high schools. And this is something I go all over the world saying this, because it becomes about the intention and what it is that you're doing. Like when I'm a little boy, I learned that jazz and blues are synonyms for each other, right? And the old people would always say that jazz was just blues that learned to speak all languages, right? And a huge component of that when we're speaking of blues music, jazz music, all of that is also about you as a means of, you know, sort of cathartically releasing things, also having to be fully human, which also acknowledges spirit, right? And so when you're younger and you're growing up in those environments and people are teaching you that at a very young age, you also understand why it's paramountly important to make sure that those principles in the music always stay around, right? Because, sorry, for me, when I'm 13, 14 years old in these spaces, and my teachers are talking about conjuring music, and they're talking about the energy and the intention behind a note. So when I play a note, whenever I'm playing a note, I've already thought to myself what the intention is behind that note. When you spoke earlier, you talked about my trumpet sound, and for you that being something that's captivating, but part of that is also tethered to being a person that came up as a 12 and 13-year-old person, basically being told, don't play that note without your spirit in it. Don't say that without being fully connected to what it is that you're actually trying to say, because people will be able to feel that. People will be able to sense that. And so, you know, when we speak about the histories of this music, you can't divorce that. You can't divorce what you're hearing in this context from those, also those religions and those traditions that predate jazz. And what I mean by that is like when you speak about candomblé music, when you speak about Santeria, loud traditions, all of these spaces, the music is essentially conjuring music, and jazz is the same thing. The only difference, I think, on a general level is that the musicians in New Orleans were also very intentional about making sure that what they were doing was also tethered to them reclaiming something that had been taken away. And that's also a huge component of this that I think gets left out when we speak about creative improvised music, which is the core music is actually also designed to reclaim things from the past and to bring those things and to try and approximate the things that were taken away from you. So when you're speaking about spiritual jazz versus, I guess, straight ahead jazz or other forms of jazz, the one element to me that cannot be taken out of this music, and that doesn't matter, it doesn't matter if you're making it with blonde hair or blue eyes or curly hair and brown eyes, is that the intention should always come from spirit first. So to me, there is no jazz without spirit. So the distinction has always been confusing to me because that's what the music is primarily.
I have to jump on that if you don't mind. Mark, is that all right if I?
Yeah, just real quick, then I wanted to ask Nubya. Yeah.
So all kinds of things are sparking as you're talking, Christian, and one of them, if I can just get personal for a second, I grew up in Hawaii, and so I had a lot of contact with Hawaiian culture, Native Hawaiian culture, which is very spirit oriented. You know, it's an indigenous people, and they were a big part of the entire, you know, social fabric in Hawaii. And so I grew up with that in the islands. And then I made the decision, like, all right, I need to move east. I'm going to plug into this jazz scene. I'm going to go to, you know, I went to Philadelphia first, and I went to New York, and I felt like, all right, well, and that's over there. That's that thing. And then this is this thing. And to me, jazz was visceral and cerebral, and the spiritual element was not really factored in. And actually, it was going to New Orleans was one of the things that helped me put the pieces together, because the first time I went to New Orleans, I was like, why does it feel so familiar here? Like, why do I feel so at home? You know what I mean? And it reminded me of my home, and a lot of that had to do with the expression that you're talking about. This idea that spirit is fundamental, it's integral, it's everywhere, and also the idea of a reclamation, which is, I think, you know, when you talk about New Orleans and a place like Honolulu, that's the thing that they have in common too, is that the culture has been commodified, and it is actually the primary driver of the economy in a lot of ways, is the commodification of the culture, right?
Right, same in New Orleans.
Yeah. So it was actually a process for me of reconstituting that spiritual identity in the music and sort of resituating it, you know, and saying like, oh, it's not just Pharoah Sanders when he's doing his thing that means spiritual jazz. So I'm agreeing with Christian that like ideally it is everywhere. Now, as Gio knows, having reviewed some shows, I mean, there are nights when you're sitting in a club and there is no spirit in the room, and it is, and maybe the technical accomplishment is very high, and maybe some cool things are happening, but it's not, the spirit is not there. And so, you know, that happens too. But I just, something about the way that you were expressing yourself, Christian, just, it really struck a chord with me because I had to make that journey. I had to sort of find my way back to it in a way.
Mm.
Yeah, Nubya, if you wanted to jump in on that.
Yeah, definitely. What you're saying, Christian, definitely resonated with me in the way that, to me, like I've definitely seen the term and heard the term kind of thrown around, spiritual jazz and all of this, and even in a couple of bands that I'm a part of, like, oh, this is what they play, and kind of in a way to, well, it's usually to like sell it, isn't it? You know, it's always to sell the ticket. Like, this is what you should expect, and this is why you should buy the ticket, because you're a fan of this type of music, rather than the whole like music as a whole. But that's, you know, part of the other conversation about labeling everything. But for me, I think playing music has always been about playing it with my whole self, with my whole spirit, with my soul. And in various institutions, it hasn't been at the forefront. And I think those are the times that I've like lost myself in terms of why I choose to play this music, and why I didn't even choose to play the music. It fully, as cheesy as it sounds, like it fully chooses you, I think, when you choose to like let it in, all of it, and give yourself to it each and every time you play. You're just I feel like an instrument in that way, rather than like putting my ego at the forefront of it. Like, it's all about me. It should be about, like you said, Christian, what's your intent? Doing this album this time round, obviously we can't play it, so the intent is like very difficult for me to deal with when I'm just talking about it, because I don't have the balance of like every night I get to share the intention, I get to share the feeling. I don't even have to talk about the tunes if I don't want to, I just get to play. But without that, it really showed me the importance of displaying my spirit within the music through the way that I have to talk about it now, because that's what I'm doing. But rather than playing it, but I feel so much more importance around the story of the music, around the intention of the music, around explaining the spirit if I can't play it to you, explaining how important the intention is behind this album and each story within the album and the narrative as a whole, because that's how I'm communicating at the moment. Everybody has the record, obviously, and you can go and listen to a record and feel it without me describing what it is about, or without someone analyzing it for you. And that is the spirit of the music. And you can have that, I can't remember who said it, but someone just said, you know, when you go somewhere else and you feel like you're at home. That's how I felt when I went to Brazil, when I went back to the Caribbean for the first time, and I'd never been there before. I was like 11, and I was like, how have I've been here before, but I don't know how. In Colombia, in all over the world, you don't even speak the same language with words, but you can play with anyone if you are truly listening, if you're truly present, if you truly intend to be a part of something bigger than yourself. Yeah, so that's my take on it. I think it's a huge important part of it that does get left out often, and I think I'm truly learning the importance of talking about that side of it, as well as I'm a musician and this is what I do and here's my album. It's like I'm trying to communicate that side of things more. If I can't do that through the music that I play each gig, I'm trying to do that with the intention behind the music and where the music has come from, which is my soul and my spirit, which is also my ancestors' souls and my ancestors' spirit, and all the music that I've absorbed in all kinds of genres for my whole life.
Okay, well, it looks like this time flew away on us, so I got time for one more question. I really appreciate y'all for taking the time seriously. I know it went by real fast, right?
Really quick.
Needed
That
2
was
hours
fast.
for the panel.
Seriously.
We're gonna take a 15-minute break and then second set.
Part two, go get a bag lunch, and come back. But no, I just had one more question, and this is for everybody. I mean, because I feel like we all engage in creativity, whether it's creative writing, obviously music. How do you extract peace in such a turbulent landscape? It's something I've been struggling with. So I'm curious to know how we're all doing that. And Gio, if you could start that off, that'd be great.
Oh man, give me the hard
I know,
one.
right?
Peace in 2020, like, are you serious? Okay. Let's see. Just to piggyback a little bit off of what was being said before, and I mean, just so much, but I mean, I just had the ghosts of Octavia Butler and Amiri Baraka sort of swimming together, thinking about change, the Butler notion that God is change, and what Amiri Baraka said in The Changing Same, as I'm sure a lot of us here are familiar, but especially you, Nate, I think you've cited it, his notion that there is spirituality in all Black music, because the impulse is to do new and to do change and to make sound out of that, and that's as much a spiritual work as you can really even imagine. So I love the idea that we were sort of talking about breaking down that dichotomy between spiritual jazz and non-spiritual, and I think there's a reservoir there in terms of like the way that has been part of the music's survival, really. And I think now, I mean, the joy is that when everything is so hard, that the work of getting inside this music and learning from this music is joyful work. Like, it can feel like a place where it didn't get any simpler, it didn't get any easier this year, but it's also so rich and so full of information. And especially now that we've got a world around us that at least feels more compelled to entertain some of these really hard questions and to do more listening, I think this music is a really crucial place to start from a broad standpoint. And then more specifically, I guess, especially over the summer and into the early fall, I alluded to it earlier, just to go outside and to hear music so much in my neighborhood or places around me in New York. It's been refreshing, because one thing if we had more time, I wanted to hear Christian respond to Nubia's point about talking about the music versus playing it, because Christian, I've always loved how that exchange, and that balance between talking about where the music comes from and then delivering it to people, unfiltered, unfettered, and direct, has always been really, really bound up for you in your extremely powerful stage performances. And now I think is a time to remind ourselves of the importance of the live act and the importance of the local. I mean, you had people at the beginning of quarantine talking about, can we go to church on Zoom, right? And people were doing that. But they were like, man, it's just not the same. And it's the same with music. And maybe we can remind ourselves that we've been listening to records, trying to scratch out of that surface something that we can't necessarily get unless we're in communion together. So as things return or whatever, or as we envision a new model for everything, hopefully, maybe there can be more emphasis on the local, there can be more emphasis on the in-person, there can be less emphasis on the kinds of commodification that are required, as you mentioned, Nubya, when you're trying to mass produce and mass sell a musical offering. And there can be more focus on how much can be gained in this direct communion of whatever it is, the local scene around you, the place that you live in. I think that's where a lot of this growth can be done. And for me, it's been a joyful experience amidst all of this to see so much local music making occurring again.
Okay, well, I think we got to leave it there. I'm looking at my time.
Oh, I'm
so
sorry, guys.
It.
Look at me going on and
No,
on.
no. You all were great, man. You all were great. So no, I really appreciate it. Seriously, this was a really good talk, and it's good to talk to people who have the spirit in the music, and they're trying to convey something very real through the writing and the music. And like I said at the top, I'm a legit fan of everybody on this call. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for bringing us
Thank
together.
you.
Thank you.
Yeah, no
Mike.
problem, bro.
Absolutely. Thank you so
Good to
much.
see you guys, man. Thank you all too.
I know, you too.
Thank you too.
All right.
And
Yes.
guys,
Thank you so
You
much.
will.
yeah.